Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches, episode 11. If you could speak with any Thomist, be it medieval, modern, or contemporary, of whom would you choose? This episode is part of a sub-series called Answers to Analogy, where we discuss the different ways historical Thomists in the medieval and Renaissance era have responded to Duns Scotus' arguments for Univocity. In this podcast episode, we will be giving a brief introduction to Scotus' arguments for the univocal concept of being, and we will give some necessary background by analyzing the works of both Thomas Aquinas and Henry of Ghent. Thank you all so much for listening, and enjoy the podcast episode.
Hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night. All the heavens seem to twinkle with a crystalline delight. Keeping time, time, time with this sort of runic rhyme. From the tintinnabulation that so musically wells. From the bells, 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 bells. From the jingling and the tinkling of the bells.
So before we discuss Duns Scotus, we will first discuss Thomas Aquinas' understanding of analogical predication and his reasons for establishing analogical naming in the first place. After that, we will analyze closely the writings of Henry of Ghent and his understanding of analogy, since Scotus is technically responding to Henry instead of Aquinas. Finally, we will discuss Duns Scotus' understanding of analogy and his emphasis on univocal predication in our naming of God. Now just a few quick notes. Aquinas is certainly the most famous, but is certainly not the first, to argue for using analogy in metaphysics and semantics. While there is certainly a tradition of describing God through analogy that precedes Aquinas, for the sake of time, we will not be discussing much of what came before. Having said that, I may devote a future episode to specifically that subject, and there's a great article by E.J. Ashworth that delves into the history of analogy that I'll link in the description below. Another quick note. This podcast assumes the listener already has at least some cursory knowledge of St. Thomas's doctrine of analogy. But if the listener is hearing about all this for the first time, there is a great video that I'll link in the description below as well for clarification. So Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century Dominican theologian, was one of the medieval scholastic geniuses who articulated an understanding of analogy in describing God. Familiar readers of Aquinas know that Aquinas posits analogy as a sort of middle way between two extremes, that being the fallacy of equivocation, or the other extreme, that of univocal predication. On the one hand, the attributes we predicate of God cannot be equivocal to the attributes we predicate of creatures, for if they were, then all of our theologic, or all of our God talk, would be completely meaningless, and it would be subject to the fallacy of equivocation. Aquinas writes in the Summa as follows, quote, "Neither, on the other hand, are names applied to God and creatures in a purely equivocal sense, as some have said, because if that were so, it follows that from creatures nothing could be known or demonstrated about God at all. For the reasoning would always be exposed to the fallacy of equivocation. Such a view is against the philosophers, who proved many things about God, and also against what the Apostle says, the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Therefore it must be said that these names are said of God and of creatures in an analogical sense, which is to say according to proportion." End quote. Aquinas rejects equivocal predication in fear that it would lead to the destruction of all scientific knowledge concerning God in theology. But on the other hand, Aquinas rejects the notion that we should predicate things univocally, as this would destroy God's simplicity. Aquinas writes, quote, "The reason of this is that every effect which is not an adequate result of the power of the efficient cause receives the similitude of the agent not in its full degree, but in a measure that falls short. So, that what is divided and multiplied in the effects resides in the agent simply, and in the same manner, as for example the sun by exercise of its one power produces a manifold and various forms in all inferior things. In the same way, as said in the preceding article, all perfections existing in creatures, divided and multiplied, pre-exist in God unitedly." End quote. Just as God is perfect, and all creation falls short of that perfection, The perfections that exist within creation, like goodness, truth, and being, cannot be univocally predicated of God. In addition to this, Aquinas is concerned that if we predicate things univocally of God, then we reduce being to a genus, and thereby must account for some specific difference in God between God and creation. But if there is specific difference in God, then the theologian cannot account for God's divine simplicity. So now that Aquinas has rejected both equivocal and univocal predication in our names said of God, Aquinas defends a third position, which he thinks is the middle between two extremes, that being analogical predication. Rather than being predicated in the exact same sense, Aquinas holds that being and perfection are predicated analogically of both God and creation. Aquinas writes, quote, "And in this way some things are said of God and creatures analogically, and not in a purely equivocal nor in a purely univocal sense. For we can name God only from creatures. Thus, whatever is said of God and creatures is said according to the relation of a creature to God as its principle and cause, wherein all perfections of things pre-exist excellently." Now this mode of community of idea is a mean between pure equivocation and simple univocation. For in analogies, the idea is not, as it is in the univocals, one and the same, yet it is not totally diverse, as in the equivocals, but a term which is thus used in a multiple sense signifies various proportions to some one thing. Thus healthy applied to urine signifies the sign of animal health, and applied to medicine signifies the cause of the same health. In addition to God, Aquinas thinks that substance and accident and all the 10 categories of Aristotle are predicated analogically, and he makes it a point to mention this in his treatise De Principis Naturae. Now, interestingly enough, Aquinas argues in this particular passage of the Summa Theologica for a theory of analogy known as the analogy of attribution, or what some have dubbed the healthy model. What is peculiar for Aquinas is that he does not always use this particular model of analogy in all of his works. And as we shall soon see, there is at least one other model Aquinas uses when describing analogical predication. Thomas Aquinas uses at least two models for analogy throughout his works, that being the analogy of proportionality, or pros hens, and the analogy of attribution. The first model, the analogy of proportionality, is found mostly in Aquinas' earlier works. The model stipulates that our analogous names of God and creatures are proportional to one another, which is to say that God's being and perfection is to God what our being and perfection is to us. So for instance, Aquinas uses the example of sight being predicated of an animal's eye and the intellectual faculty of a human soul, seeing. Just as we can accurately say that a bat, for instance, sees something through echolocation, or a deer sees an object, so too can we say that our agent intellect sees the quiddity of substances, albeit in a higher and more perfect manner. With God and creation, we can truly predicate wisdom, goodness, being, and power, etc. to God, but just like with sight, the perfection in question subsists in a higher and more perfect way in God than it does in creation. The second model Aquinas uses for analogical predication is what is sometimes referred to as analogy ad unum, or the analogy of attribution. Aquinas uses the example of health being used to describe animals, urine, and medicine. Just as healthy is predicated of animals in a prior sense, and only secondarily in the instances of urine and medicine, so too is God's perfection predicated in a prior sense, and only secondarily in creation. If there were no animals, there wouldn't be any urine, nor would there be healthy medicine. So too with God, if there were no God, causing and conserving our existence and perfection, then there would be no perfection in creation. Conversely, we could also describe medicine as being the cause and the health of the animal as the effect. Just as God's perfection is the cause, our perfection is the effect of the cause. As Aquinas says, quote, "Now names are thus used in two ways, either according as many things are proportionate to one. Thus, for example, healthy predicated of medicine and urine in relation and in proportion to health of a body, of which the former is the sign and the latter the cause, or according as one thing is proportionate to another. Thus healthy is said of medicine and animal, since medicine is the cause of health in the animal body." End quote. Because of Aquinas' use of the church father Dionysius the Areopagite, later Aquinas tends to articulate an understanding of analogy through attribution, where perfections are spoken of principally and perfectly in God, and imperfectly and through participation in creation. Much more can be said in regards to Aquinas' use of Dionysus, and I'll put a few sources in the description for anyone interested. Now, what is interesting about Aquinas is that he has both of these theories of analogy in his works, with the analogy of proportionality found in his earlier works, the De Veritate, and the analogy of attribution found in his later works, that of Summa Contra Gentiles and Summa Theologica. Aquinas does not really seem to engage with how these two theories fit together, or if he even intended for them to fit together at all. And as we shall soon see, it'll be the job of later Thomists to try to make sense of these two theories and to try to see which of them makes the most sense using in analogy. So now we turn to the difficulties that later Thomists are going to have to resolve in the coming centuries. Dominic de Tor reads at least 3 topics that Thomists will consistently dispute over the doctrine of analogy, that being what he calls the model problem, the ratio or concept problem, and the equivocation problem. With the model problem, what later Thomists are going to argue over is which of the two theories should the theologian use when describing God. Are the two theories in conflict with one another? Did Aquinas initially prefer proportionality and then discard it for attribution? To this day, Thomists are divided upon how to interpret the two models that Aquinas posits. And later Thomists in the tradition will either have to show them to be compatible or argue for one model over the other. Some Thomists, like Hervaeus Natalis, will show a preference for the healthy model, whereas later Thomists like John Capriolus and Dominic of Flanders are going to have a preference for proportionality as the model for analogy. The second problem is what de Tor calls the ratio or concept problem, and this problem is whether or not the analogates fall under one concept in our minds, or whether or not there are multiple concepts that correspond to different analogates. When we use analogy, do the analogates fall under one ratio or one concept that is just applied to in different ways, or are there multiple concepts for each different analogate? According to George Klubertans, Aquinas tends to describe analogy as falling under one ratio in his earlier works, and tends to describe analogy as falling under multiple and distinct ratio in his later works. What the later Thomists are going to have to figure out is whether or not there is one concept that is unequally participated, or if there are multiple concepts. Some of the earlier Thomists, like Thomas Sutton and Hervaeus Natalis, are going to maintain that there are multiple concepts in analogy, whereas later Thomists, like Capriolus, are going to hold that there is one concept that is unequally participated as the basis for analogy. Finally, this last problem is whether or not the use of analogy falls into the fallacy of equivocation. Peter of Spain, a medieval logician, defined equivocation as, quote, a deception caused in us from the inability to distinguish the diverse rationes in absolutely the same name, end quote. For instance, if a theologian were to use the different notions of being or goodness or truth in their syllogistic reasoning, it could be possible that they could be equivocating. To borrow an example from de Tor, it would be as though a person were to equivocate the different meanings of the word healthy. The word healthy could be used to describe an animal, or it could be used to describe a product of an animal. If someone were to use them in a syllogism like this, everything healthy is an animal, urine is healthy, therefore urine is an animal, they would be guilty of equivocating the different meanings of healthy. What the Thomist is going to have to argue for is that analogy is able to escape any sort of fallacious equivocation in syllogistic reasoning. The way a Thomist will solve this problem will largely depend upon their answer to the rationes problem. Thomists like Capriolus and Flandrensis, who hold to a single concept of being under which the analogates fall, are able to more easily answer this problem, as we shall soon see. But other Thomists like Thomas Sutton and Hervaeus Natalis, who hold to multiple concepts for the analogates, will have a more difficult time in answering this problem. So to recap, Aquinas argues for the analogy of being as he sees it as a middle way between two extremes. He rejects equivocal predication for obvious reasons, and he rejects univocity because it would destroy God's simplicity. Aquinas in his works argues for at least two versions of analogy, that being the analogy of proportionality and the analogy of attribution. The three unresolved difficulties that are left to the Thomist is the model problem, the ratio or concept problem, and the problem of equivocation. What Thomists are going to try to solve in the coming centuries are these problems in the backdrop of Scotus's critiques. So now that we've discussed Aquinas' theories of analogy, we now turn to the great Parisian theologian of the late 13th century, Henry of Ghent. Henry develops his own version of analogical reasoning, which is in slight contrast with Aquinas'. And while Aquinas' version is much more well known, Scotus is technically responding to Henry of Ghent's articulation of analogy, not Aquinas'. Now, the reasoning that Henry gives for analogy is that he fears that if we reduce being to univocal predication, then we ultimately reduce being to a genus, with the need for specific differences between God and the creature. As this notion flies in the face of divine simplicity, and because Henry thinks there is no common basis in reality for a univocal concept, Henry holds to a twofold conceptual model of analogy. We have a concept of God's existence, which we deduce from creatures, and a concept of creaturely existence that we have apprehended. Now, later medieval theologians, most especially Duns Scotus, are going to take issue with his understanding of analogy, because, at least to their way of thinking, if there is no single univocal concept that underlies our concepts of God and of creation, then theological science, which begins with creatures and ends with the demonstration of God's existence, would be an impossibility. But at the same time, Henry's motivations for maintaining analogy is that, because God and creatures agree in no way in their active existence, any sort of univocal predication would be devoid of meaning and extramental existence. In addition to this, Henry's insistence that univocity would reduce being to a genus-specific determination also has to be answered, and Duns Scotus' replies to Henry, as we will soon see, take these objections quite seriously in answering them. Before I begin, I want to preface that trying to give an exhaustive account of Duns Scotus' understanding of semantics would be quite difficult. Because of this, we are going to focus on three things about Scotus' philosophy of language, specifically as it pertains to his doctrine of univocity. We'll first discuss the argument that Scotus lays out in his work The Ordinatio. Then we'll discuss the type of concepts Scotus argues for and why it is that he argues for it. Now, Scotus actually has 5 arguments for univocity, but for the sake of time, I will try my best to look at one of them and then go over the others as we progress in the podcast. And then finally, we will briefly discuss Scotus' replies to Henry of Ghent's worries about univocity. Scotus argues that there is at least one concept, or one ratio, in the mind that can be univocally predicated of all genera and species and of God and creation. This concept is distinct from our concepts of finite and eternal being, or substance and accident. Scotus proves this concept with the following argument, quote, "Every intellect that is certain about one concept and doubtful about other concepts has a concept about which it is certain that is other than the concepts about which it is doubtful." The subject includes the predicate. But the intellect of the wayfarer can be certain about God that God is a being while doubting whether God is a finite or infinite being, created or uncreated. Therefore, the concept of being that the intellect of the wayfarer has about God is other than the former and the latter concept, that is, finite and infinite being. And so the concept of being is neither of them, and it is included in both of them. Therefore, it must be univocal. End quote. Taken from his Ordinatio, we can express the argument in syllogistic form like this. Premise 1. A person cannot be certain and doubtful about the same concept. Premise 2. We can be certain that God exists, or that there is a first principle, while being doubtful whether or not the first principle is infinite or finite in being. The conclusion? Therefore, there is a univocal concept, distinct from both finite and infinite being, that can be applicable to both. Scotus takes the first premise as axiomatic, that we cannot know and doubt the same thing at the same time, and he proves the second premise with reference to the ancient Greek philosophers, the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics were philosophers and early scientists who tried to give an account of what the first principle of being was in the world. Some, like Thales, claimed the first principle was water, and others, like Heraclitus, held that the first principle was fire, and others still believe the first principle to be a transcendent logos, or reason governing the universe, etc. Scotus argues that while the pre-Socratics were certain that there was a first principle governing all things, they were unsure whether or not the first principle was infinite or finite, created or uncreated, etc. And so, Scotus reasons by this that there must be a concept that is univocally predicated, not only for God, but for all creatures and genera. We might know that something is an accident or a substance, or finite or infinite, but that is something that is entirely different from the concept that there is something that exists. Scotus believes this concept, that there is something that exists, can be applied to everything, and it can be applied univocally. Scotus's conditions for a univocal concept is that a univocal concept, 1, to affirm or to deny it results in a contradiction, and 2, it can function in the middle term of a syllogism. If I were to say, for instance, that Socrates is healthy with respect to his body and not healthy with respect to his body, I would be using healthy univocally. But if I were to say that Socrates is healthy with respect to his body and not healthy with respect to his personality, I would be using equivocal notions of healthy. Scotus also argues that the concept must function in the middle term of a syllogism for it to be univocal. So now that Scotus has argued for a concept that is distinct from all our other concepts of being, we now have to ask ourselves, what type of concept has Scotus just argued for in his work? Is it a logical concept with no basis in reality? Is it a concept in which all things participate in? Does this concept make being into a genus? Well, to the latter charge, Scotus makes it clear that God and creation do not agree in reality. God is infinite, perfect, and uncreated, whereas all of creation is finite, imperfect, and are simply creatures. Scotus writes, quote, "It is clear from what has been said that God and creatures are wholly diverse, really, agreeing in no reality, and nevertheless they agree in one concept." Having said all this, Scotus claims that this concept can be predicated and applied to everything that exists, and it can be applied univocally. So the question is, how can a concept be applied univocally to things that do not agree in any way? Well, Scotus' solution is to claim that, while things in themselves are determinately different, we can strip anything of their determinations or intrinsic mode of existence until we are left with the simple notion of something that has being. Anything that has being, whether it be material or immaterial, finite or infinite, created or uncreated, Scotus thinks that we can conceptually strip away all the defining determinations until we are left with the one simple notion of something that exists. So even though things in reality do not agree, they nevertheless can be stripped of all their defining characteristics so that being, or just the notion of existence, is there. The concept that Scotus employs is real insofar as it comes from the phantasm of existing things, but it is conceptual because the notion does not exist outside of the intellect, but is encrusted over with particular determinations. As Gerrit Smith writes, quote, "If we abstract far enough, we arrive at a pure concept of being, a concept which is indifferent to both God and creatures. The concept of being corresponds to no reality outside the intellect, for it is an abstraction from the concept of a creature that itself is outside the intellect. Once we abstract to the pure concept of being, we can contract it to a concept of God, by adding to it the features proper to God, such as the intrinsic modes of infinity and necessity." Unquote. So with the concept of being, Scotus claims to have shown that a univocal concept can be predicated of everything. This concept does not correspond to anything outside the intellect, but can nevertheless be predicated of everything once we conceptually strip anything of its intrinsic modes of perfection. To borrow an example given by Michael Sullivan, it is a bit like the concept of causation. We don't encounter simply the notion of causation outside of our intellects. We encounter things that cause other things, encrusted over with particular instances, particular circumstances, and particular ways of causing other things to be. And this concept of causation can be applied univocally to both God and creation, even though that the ways God and creation cause things are diverse and different. So why does Scotus go through all the trouble of showing this univocal concept? Scotus himself holds to both ontic analogy as well as even a conceptual analogy. So why does he posit a univocal concept that underlies all our thinking? Well, Scotus is concerned that if we do not have one concept that is univocally predicated of everything that exists, we are left with diverse concepts that cannot be unified in science and demonstration. If Henry of Ghent is right that there is not one but two concepts of being, then what would become of syllogistic argumentation? We would always be equivocating the different meanings and notions of being when we talk, and science would become an impossibility. We would always be equivocating if there were nothing that united all our notions, and thus we must have recourse to a univocal concept to salvage our demonstration and science. As Stephen Dumont writes, quote, "In Scotus's view, Henry of Ghent's position is an evasion that destroys all univocity, for then it could always be said of any univocal notion that it was not a single concept, but two equivocal concepts mistaken for a univocal one. So Scotus critiques and modifies Henry of Ghent's views. Whereas Henry of Ghent held that the intellect confusedly believes there was one concept of being, Scotus argues that there really is a distinct univocal concept present in our minds. To review, Scotus argues for a concept in our minds that can be predicated of everything univocally, through his argument about certitude and doubt. He argues for a concept that, while it is derived from things as they exist, nevertheless it is logical in that it agrees with nothing that exists. Nothing is simply being, but is a different determination of being. Finally, Scotus posits the univocity of the concept of being because, at least in his view, to do so otherwise would be to abandon all our natural knowledge of God. Finally, Scotus does not think that his concept reduces being to a genus, because the intrinsic modes of being are not accidents. God is not accidentally infinite, but intrinsically and properly designated as infinite in his mode of being. The perfections God has, he has because God is infinite in being, and they in no way are accidental to his being. So now that we've given a brief description of Thomas and Henry's views on analogy, and we've discussed Scotus's doctrine of analogy, we now must ask ourselves, what is a Thomist to make of Scotus's arguments? Well, suffice it to say, the medieval Thomistic tradition had their work cut out for them. To reiterate Detour, the commentators of St. Thomas have three problems that they have to try and solve: the model problem, the ratio or concept problem, and the equivocation problem. With the model problem, the Thomist is going to have to determine which model of analogy is appropriate for theology, the proportionality model or the attribution model. Aquinas never definitively writes which of the two theories is to be used, or if they ever relate to one another. What later Thomists are going to have to decide is which of the two should be used and how. The other problem, the rationes or concept problem, also posits a difficulty. Does analogy fall under one concept or multiple concepts that correspond to multiple analogs? Earlier Thomists like Thomas Sutton and Hervaeus Natalis hold to multiple concepts that correspond to multiple analogs. Later medieval and Renaissance Thomists like John Capriolus and Dominic of Flanders hold to one concept that is unequally participated. Finally, the equivocation problem, the problem Scotus raises against Henry, must also be answered, and many Thomists will provide numerous arguments in attempts to prevent Aquinas' analogy from going the way of Henry's. This problem will largely depend on a Thomist's answers to the concept problem, and the Thomists who hold to a single concept, like Capriolus and Flandrensis, are able to more easily answer this problem. Other Thomists, like Sutton and Natalis, who hold to multiple concepts, will have a more difficult time answering this problem. And for the Scotistic tradition, there are problems to address as well. In addition to univocity, Scotus writes in his works about how concepts are analogical, and indeed, Scotus himself seems to hold to a version of the analogy of attribution. Later Scotists in the medieval tradition will try to develop Scotistic analogy and univocity, with some Scotists, such as Petrus Thome, developing complicated theories on the subject of analogy. In addition to this, Scotus is not altogether clear in his writings about how conceptual his conceptual univocity is. Scotus maintains that his univocal concept is derived from creatures and yet is not present in creatures. What later Scotists are going to dispute is which category does Scotus's concept fall into. Is it more of a logical concept that the intellect creates, or does it have more of a foundation in the things that exist? This will be a topic of dispute for later generations of Scotists, such as Antonius Andreas, Peter Navarre, and Petrus Thome. Thank you all so much for listening to the pilot episode of Answers to Analogy. In the coming episodes, I'll be detailing the diverse and different responses Thomists have given to Scotus's worries and arguments. We'll start in chronological order with the 14th century Thomists and conclude with the later Renaissance Thomists. Thank you all so much for listening, and God bless.
Hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night. All the heavens seem to twinkle with a crystalline delight. keeping time with a sort of runic rhyme. From the tintinnabulation that so musically well. From the bells, 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 bells. From the jingling and the tinkling